This is Pasewalk, today in northeastern Germany, not far from the Polish border and the very large city of Szczecin. When I lived in Szczecin in 1995, I went past the road sign for Pasewalk every day and thought that I ought to visit the town, the place where Hitler had been when World War I came to an end. It took me until 2024 to do so, nearly 30 years later. When I went to Pasewalk on an August summer Sunday, it resembled a ghost town. Hardly anyone could be seen in the streets. Despite being 1/3 of a century since the collapse of East Germany, the dominant architecture remains what I would call very DDRish.
Skręć w prawo.
Here? You're joking? Oh no.
This, of course, should be no surprise. During the fighting in late April 1945, in the war started by Pasewalk's most infamous patient, large parts of the town were destroyed. However, somewhat miraculously it would seem, the medieval city walls remained intact. I didn't have the address of where the hospital was where Hitler had been treated. There were no signs to direct me. However, it was easy to find. The street was Schützenhausstraße, and it was logical that the Schützenhaus would once have been there. It was right next to the spa where the tree still stands, which in Nazi times was reputed to be the spot where Hitler had decided to become a
Po
politician.
100 metrach skręć w lewo. Następnie dotarłeś do celu.
Skręć w lewo.
Lekko w lewo. Następnie dotarłeś do celu. Po 50 metrach dotarłeś do celu.
This might look like a field anywhere. It's hard to believe that in this fallow field, one of the most important decisions in the 20th century was taken. Or maybe it was taken here. National Socialist legend had it that it was under this tree, which for a brief period in its life was called the Hitlerlinde, that Hitler decided to become a politician. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's go back in time to the middle of the 19th century. Then, this field was part of a brickworks located just outside the town. In September 1859, a local business person, Christian Darling, bought it. He converted it into a restaurant, which was described in his advertising brochures as having attractively landscaped gardens. Other construction projects included a hotel, a hall with a stage, and a shooting range for the local Schützenfest, from which the building eventually got its name. Schützenfest means Marksman's Festival in German. Business was so good that by the turn of the century it was one of the first buildings in the town to be given a telephone number 363, which meant that bookings could be taken, assuming of course that the person making the booking had access to a telephone. The area to the north of Berlin, indeed a whole swathe of territory from the Elbe to the Niemen rivers, is that of what I have seen described as a region of black lakes. Maybe they're not so black, but lakes dominate. This area was popular with tourists from Berlin and other places. This meant that Pasewalk had good rail connections whilst maintaining an air of being away from it all. In the summer of 1914, as the Second German Reich went to war, it requisitioned 7 properties in Pasewalk: a school, 5 large private houses, and the Schützenhaus buildings. The Schützenhaus buildings were equipped with beds for around 30 patients, who were cared for by 15 doctors, nurses and orderlies under the direction of Wilhelm Schröder. The requisition happened so quickly that I'm sure that this was planned well in advance of the war, in the case that a conflict should begin. I'm sure they do that today as well, that many buildings have been designated to be requisitioned should a conflict or major disaster happen. As the war progressed, it's unlikely to have offered such good conditions for the wounded. The number of beds would have been increased, and there was an effort to have a quicker turnaround of patients. The ratio of medical staff to those needing their attention also suffered. The Pasewalk Schützenhaus was for the lightly injured, those that needed medical attention and observation, but who could be expected to be in good enough condition to return to their units within a short period of time. It was not equipped with advanced surgical equipment. To a certain extent, it was more like a place where the injured could have a rest whilst remaining under medical supervision. On the morning of the 14th of October 1918, Adolf Hitler was near Wervik in Flanders. There was a mustard gas attack from the British lines. Hitler later described it in Mein Kampf. If the poison got into his eyes, the eyelids would quickly swell up and cause severe pain, leading to functional blindness. If there were no complications, the symptoms often disappeared completely after a few weeks, as was the case with Hitler. Those wounded in this way were classified as lightly wounded. We might not consider today that blindness caused by gas poisoning to be a light injury. However, we need to consider the conditions that existed at the time. Adolf Hitler had been in hospital earlier during the war. His first stay was at Berlich Heilstätten, where he was treated for a leg injury from the 9th of October to the 4th of December 1916. With the classification of a light injury, Hitler was admitted to the Pasewalk Reserve Hospital on the 21st of October 1918 under the number 7361 with the diagnosis gas poisoning. The convalescence usually lasted 4 weeks. Let's now jump forward a quarter of a century. In 1943, Dr. Karl Kroner told US naval intelligence that he had treated Hitler and had been unable to diagnose any physical damage. According to Kroner, Hitler was then examined by the psychiatrist Edmund Foster, who diagnosed him with hysteria. When I was preparing this study, I tried to get a definition of the word hysteria as it was used at the beginning of the 20th century. Although the condition had been documented as far back as ancient Egypt, until the end of the 19th century it was presumed to be something only females suffered from. This was changed above all by Sigmund Freud, although of course others were involved too. The best definition I can give that hysteria is an uncontrollable emotional excess and can refer to a temporary state of behaviour, mind or emotion. Today, hysteria is not accepted as a medical diagnosis, and the blanket diagnosis of hysteria has been fragmented into many other conditions. There has since been speculation that Foster treated him with hypnosis, which was one of the cures advanced since the end of the 19th century. I think it highly unlikely that Foster treated him at all, and for that matter, I think it dubious that Kroner treated him. Due to the scant records we don't know, I think that Karl Kroner was attempting to make himself necessary to US intelligence in order to facilitate his visa to the United States. He'd been in Iceland since 1938, doing odd manual jobs despite being a highly qualified neurologist. His German qualifications were not recognized in Iceland. He had been forced to leave Germany by the Nazi regime's persecution of Jews. My interpretation is that accusing Hitler of having a condition which until not long before had been seen as being something which affected only women is a way of belittling him. Furthermore, I suspect that the cure of hypnosis is suggested for conditions at the time to suggest madness. Whether or not hypnosis cures what may be described as hysteria, I don't know. But I learned a method in France for language acquisition using hypnosis, and the results were outstanding. However, it very much depends on the ability of the teacher and how calm the student is and how willing that student is to go under hypnosis. From my highly limited experience, I would suggest that Hitler, no way, was someone who could have gone under hypnosis. Hitler described in Mein Kampf how he learned of the end of the war and his decision to become a politician as follows. On the 10th of November, the pastor came to the hospital to give a short speech. Now we found out everything. I was extremely excited and was present at the short speech. The old, dignified gentleman seemed to be shaking very much when he told us that the House of Hohenzollern was no longer to wear the German imperial crown, that the fatherland had become a republic. What followed were terrible days and even worse nights. I knew that everything was lost. Only fools or liars and criminals could hope for the mercy of the enemy. During these nights my hatred grew, hatred against the perpetrators of this act. In the days that followed, I also became aware of my fate. I had to laugh now at the thought of my own future, which had caused me such bitter worries only a short time ago. There is no pact with the Jew, only the hard either or. Thus, I decided to become a politician. Here we have a photograph from the Pasewalk military hospital. At the front in the middle we have Dr. Wilhelm Schröder. But who is this character at the back? Does he remind you of anyone? I accept that he does look a bit like Adolf Hitler, and if this photograph dates to November 1918, it might well be him. But to be quite honest, if we're looking at people in the photograph, I think that this gentleman looks more like Stalin, and I'm going to presume that he didn't just pop round to Pasewalk Lazarette in November 1918 to see his future ally Adolf Hitler. In any case, none of those shown here appear to have any really serious injuries. Of course, it could be argued that those who did have the serious injuries weren't in the picture. The story goes on that Hitler lost his sight again after learning of Germany's defeat in the war. Hitler himself said this in Mein Kampf. In 2011, Dr. Thomas Weber of the University of Aberdeen, the author of Hitler's First War, made a discovery that might confirm this in the form of two letters. Dr. Ottfried Förster, a renowned neurosurgeon, wrote to two prominent American neurologists, Victor Gonder and Foster Kennedy, that he had seen Hitler's medical records showing that he was treated for hysterical amblyopia, a psychiatric disorder known as hysterical blindness. Dr. Ottfried Förster was a leading neurosurgeon. His fame was international, and he had treated Lenin. He was the leading authority on neurosurgery in the 1920s and 1930s, and he received students from all over the world. He had requested and seen Hitler's medical file from Pasewalk Military Hospital in 1932. He had requested it as by this time Hitler was becoming quite famous. The career of Dr. Ottfried Förster did not progress under the Nazis, but he was not persecuted by them either. He held on to his position here in Breslau, now Wrocław, until his death in 1941. However, I reject this argument. I'm not suggesting that the record was forged or that anyone deliberately made anything up. However, it does not fit the circumstantial evidence. Whereas it might explain how Hitler suddenly became so full of hate as a part of a psychiatric disorder, we still don't know why Hitler was released from hospital so quickly after this diagnosis. In any case, I've done a separate video on the hysteria of Adolf Hitler, and a link will be posted below once the video has been uploaded. Hitler left Pasewalk on the 19th of November 1918 as fit for military service for the replacement battalion of the 2nd Bavarian Infantry Regiment in Munich. In other words, he was fit for military service only 9 days after allegedly losing his sight and then regaining it again. Let's remember that 1 month was the usual period to spend in hospital with the injuries that Hitler had. So it was completely normal that he would be released then. What is not normal is that he lost his sight again. I suggest that, at most, what might have happened is that Hitler may have blacked out for a few moments after learning of the defeat, but this was something he recovered from very quickly. However, it suited the later myth. He took the train from Pasewalk to Berlin. In the capital, he must have witnessed the events of the German Revolution. By the time he got to Munich, it's possible that he participated in them. Hitler recounted his experience in the hospital in Mein Kampf, but here Hitler was not recounting historical events, but rather, now that he was famous, was attempting to create a myth. The idea that the lowly wounded soldier, while suffering from blindness, should attempt to put right the wrong of the stab in the back was appealing, particularly the bit about losing his sight again on learning of the defeat. I think the first time Hitler thought that he decided to become a politician whilst in Pasewalk was when he was writing his book in prison in 1924. There's no record at all of him saying this to anyone else beforehand. The place of the myth, however, became a place of National Socialist tourism during the 1930s, like the prison in Landsberg where Hitler had been imprisoned, and those are places associated with the 1923 attempted putsch. Franz Feder Coburg, whom I've mentioned in other videos relating to Coburg, was in June 1934 the Gauleiter of Pomerania. The National Socialist House Cooperative Pomerania, GmbH, was founded in order to create a shrine at this location. The land was purchased at the end of 1934. The old building was razed to the ground. A single-storey building with 2 wings and a gabled central section was then built, with a consecration hall and a spacious parade and assembly area. The consecration site was opened to the public on the 21st of October 1937. Hitler himself was not present, but the ceremony was carried out by his deputy, Rudolf Hess. A hall of honour was set up with mosaics. In another room, a bust of Hitler stood on a high pedestal, which was always illuminated electrically. Above it was the epitaph, "Thus I decided to become a politician." Although a visit to Pasewalk is only a day trip from Berlin, Hitler himself never visited this place. He didn't have to. The myth had been created. A large part of Pasewalk was destroyed in the fighting at the end of April 1945. The shrine was also largely destroyed, and what was left of it was destroyed by the Soviets. Today, very little remains except for concrete blocks and parts of the wall at one end of the field, whilst at the other there's a part of a building which appears to have been part of the shrine. Nonetheless, at the nearby Lindenbad swimming pool, built as part of the shrine, there still stands a now 200-year-old linden tree. One legend has it that Hitler conceived his plan to become a politician under it. So obviously he was not so blind that he couldn't wander out of the hospital and sit under a tree where he planned how he was going to run the country once he came to power. Of course, I could be mistaken, but we've got these stones lying here, and I'm going to suggest that these stones here are part of the Nazi memorial which Rudolf Hess had built. I mean, I don't know, they might have just been put here yesterday. Well, that isn't part of Rudolf Hess, that's a transfer station, Schutzenstrasse. But this one here as well, these three here, that I all think. Not only that, I'm going to suggest that the trees were part of that monument. So these are clearly remains of I believe a sports field which was to be here. How did I manage to work out that this place was where the military hospital was, where Adolf Hitler was brought? To be quite honest, it wasn't terribly difficult, although I admit I wasn't absolutely certain. The place was called the Schutzenhaus, and given the fact there's a Schutzenstrasse, I mean, I sort of put two and two together, and in this occasion I made 4 and not 3 or 5. So that's how I managed to work it out. So I came here and I was looking for the appropriate location. I knew about the existence of this wall, what it looked like. I also knew of the trees at the back, and of course, trees could be anywhere, of course, couldn't they? I mean, I'm not very good at trees. I don't even know what type of trees they are. But I knew the shape of them, and that with everything else, and I knew of the shrine, and there was that funny building at the end. I knew of all that. So that's how I worked it out that it was here. I mean, often you've got things in archives and things, you try and put them together, and I think sometimes we can all make mistakes, and we can change our minds and things like this. In this case, I've got one of my professors called the smirk, and when the smirk is when you know after a bit of research that you are correct. And so in this case I do believe myself to be correct. This being Germany, there's no signs up here whatsoever. I mean, it's strange actually, because even when I went to Karenhal last year, and they had some signs up there, and that was absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And we've got these houses down there, and I saw somebody building on one of the houses, a couple of people, and I was thinking, do they know what actually happened here? And for that matter, do they even care? I know part of the structure is out of bounds, and the reason for that I don't know. I mean, it could be that there's something there you're not supposed to touch, but then again, it would be I think be more warnings if that were the case. Maybe because the developer doesn't want people going on there because it's going to be developed. But then again, I can't imagine here an area where people are actually leaving as being all that attractive for developers. Anyway, so that's how I managed to work it out. It's just a matter of logic. There have been many studies on Hitler's time in Pasewalk, what happened to him here and what effect this had on his future life. I tried reading some in preparation for this expose. They use a lot of long words I don't understand, and some go into very complex medical analyses. However, in doing so, I think they're missing the point. My opinion is that it's been blown out of all proportion, and that this has happened by not looking at the historical facts. Hitler was in Pasewalk as a wounded soldier. He spent the same amount of time here as anyone else would have done in his condition, and then he left. Only later did Hitler decide to make a myth out of it. Whilst convinced of his own righteousness, he wrote his biography in prison, trying to make a legend of a story that happened to tens of thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. in this Hitler was very successful, as others have added to this myth by giving all sorts of complex medical discussions on the subject. The myth remains of his conversion to becoming a politician at Pasewalk, which is just that. It's a myth. It's something that didn't happen. Meanwhile, the site of where this conversion took place awaits a developer. I hope you found this interesting. I upload every Tuesday and every Friday, and sometimes on other days too, at 2000 hours Central European time. My videos are related above all to Nazi Germany and communism, although I sometimes touch on other subjects as well. I've also done more on this Pasewalk incident as well. I live in Poland and Germany, and thus can research in these countries and have travelled extensively in them. So you see scenes in my videos of what the places look like today that I'm describing the history of. To know what I'll be uploading, then I suggest subscribing. For the moment, all the best from me in Wrocław, Poland.
Skręć w prawo. Kieruj się na północny zachód.